Hello, I'm Michael Loftus. Some 30 years ago, my family moved into a house on Reservoir Road in Kidderminster. I was intrigued by the name. There's no reservoir there now, nor is there any real sign of where there might once have been one. To find out more, I approached an older friend, a Kidderminster born and bred chap, and asked him how the name had come about. He gave a big laugh. "Oh," he said, "I remember the resi, the old resi it was. We used to swim in it when we were kids." Well, I was intrigued by his answer. Much more recently, as I've taken a greater interest in local history, I start to investigate this further, and my researchers have unveiled a deep vein of local history that really demands to be retold. So that's what I'm going to do now. It's the story of how Kidderminster was one of the very first towns in England to have a public baths or a swimming pool at all. Then there's the story of the great Golden Jubilee insurrection, when plans to build new baths came sadly unravelled. There's a story of how a reservoir was actually turned into a swimming baths, and how that reservoir cum swimming baths later became one of the very first lidos that operated in England. And as I unveiled that research, I found an awful lot more about the town and how it developed through the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. How politics changed, how the role of women changed, how the purposes and sense of what education was about changed, and finally, in the 1930s, how the great battle of the baths ensued, and the building finally of a new baths to replace the ones built first in 1851 came about. So that's what it's about. And now, then, let me tell you the tale of when Kidderminster was lengths ahead. So let's go back to July 1851. At a meeting of the town council held here in the Guildhall, Henry Chellingham, one of the councillors, presented a petition to his fellows from some 400 local citizens requesting that the council adopt recent legislation allowing them to build and operate a public baths and to use the ratepayers' money to do this. "There is not a town in the kingdom," said Chellingham, "where such baths have been established, other than the results have been most beneficial to inhabitants generally." In a town with a population of some 20,000, 400 names on the petition may not seem a lot, but at that time there were only about 500 voters who elected the council itself and its MP, so most of the voters had signed that petition. It was thus a very firm instruction to the council to get on with the plan. And indeed they did just that, and voted unanimously to adopt the legislation and to set up a committee to look at the costs and the action needed to bring the baths about. And why were public baths such a burning issue? The years of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of intense industrialisation and urbanisation, which transformed Great Britain into the most powerful nation in the world at that time. The 1851 Great Exhibition, and this is a picture of the original Great Crystal Palace where that exhibition was held, was a triumphant celebration and commemoration of that dominant place. The rapid growth that was part and parcel of that economic dominance resulted in overcrowding, poor sanitation, and generally grim living conditions. The cities and industrial towns became breeding grounds for disease. Epidemics of cholera had occurred in the early 1830s and then again in 1848-49, with some 50,000 people dying in the first outbreak and then 60,000 in the second, and all this among a national population of about 20 million people. Diseases such as typhoid, smallpox and scarlet fever were all endemic, and the realisation was dawning that it was the dirt and squalor that so many people lived in these new industrial cities that was the cause of ever-present ill health. The cartoon here might even be seen as a public health information film. Look at all of the issues it exposes: crowded streets, the overcrowded, crammed lodging houses, dung heaps everywhere, children playing in an open sewer with a dead rat, and, just to underline the point, a coffin being borne off to the right of the picture. The problems which the new urban population faced in keeping themselves and their belongings clean were being gradually recognised as a source of both disease and more general misery. Public baths, therefore, were seen as a necessary response. One of the first attempts to address the challenge of improving public health more generally in England came with the Public Baths and Washhouses Act in 1846, which gave local authorities the power to fund the building and operation of these establishments from local taxes. The Act controlled the prices to be charged at the baths so that working people, and working men in particular, could afford them. And they also gave local government scope to borrow via the government to build the baths. And this was the legislation that Kidderminster Town Council had agreed to adopt. They were one of the first towns to do so. Despite this growing public awareness of the importance of cleanliness and the benefits that it would bring about, when Chellingham came back to the council to report the findings of the committee in February 1852, he found the attitude there had changed somewhat. His committee estimated that suitable baths would cost some £2,500 to build, about £350,000 in today's money. Council members were concerned about the costs. Keeping the rates down was always the council's first priority, but they also had grave concern about the town's economic outlook. The state of trade always loomed large in the council's considerations. It did in 1851, and it was to do so for the rest of the century. There was in fact a proposal to abandon the idea of baths altogether, but they were advised this was not possible, and they were reminded of the great popular enthusiasm there had been for the baths proposal. Instead, they agreed that they would proceed slowly. The council's concern about the economic outlook was well founded. At this time, it would be appropriate to say that Kidderminster was a manufacturing town rather than an industrial one. The carpet industry, already the dominant activity in the town, still relied on hand looms to make its product. It was steam power, though, that drove the Industrial Revolution. It was only in 1851 that the technological barriers to building steam-powered looms for carpet manufacture were being overcome. The first example of these looms was in fact on show at the 1851 Great Exhibition, but Kidderminster manufacturers were unconvinced of their possibilities even when the American inventor of them, Erasmus Bigelow, brought examples to Kidderminster for them to view their potential. One of Kidderminster's greatest rivals, Crosley's of Halifax, stole a march by acquiring the patents from Bigelow, and the following decade was a desperate one for Kidderminster as steam-powered looms rendered the hand looms redundant. With wages falling, strikes and lockouts, companies failing, there was unemployment and then large-scale migration from the town. The population shrank by some 5,000 between 1851 and 1861. In the face of this impending crisis, and almost certainly not appreciating how grave it was to be, Chellingham did press on and persuaded his colleagues to allocate 50 guineas to bring in professional advice to progress the baths plans. With this sum they appointed the architectural practice of Ashbittle and Whichcourt to advise them and to design their baths. These gentlemen were in fact the leading architects in this admittedly new and rather narrow field, and were the authors of a book on the topic. They had built baths in Lambeth and in Maidstone, and were currently building in Bilston and Swansea. Their experience gave them insight into the operating expenses of such baths, as well as their building costs. John Whichcourt Jr., who dealt with the Kidderminster scheme, visited the town on a number of occasions to refine the proposals with his clients. He actually went on to some eminence in his profession. He was the president of the Royal Institute of British Architects between 1879 and 81, and the portrait you see here was commissioned to celebrate that. One of his surviving achievements is the still celebrated and famous Grand Hotel in Brighton. These are the baths that Ashbittle and Whichcourt built in Maidstone and in Bilston. As you'll see in a moment, they look rather more imposing than did the Kidderminster baths, but I'm inclined to believe that might be a matter of artistic license in these illustrations. They were in fact each only slightly larger in terms of the facilities they provided than were the baths that were built in Kidderminster. The baths project continued to be the cause of lively debate in the council chamber. This covered its desirability as well as its costs and likely operating expenses, but it did continue to draw considerable public support. At a council meeting in 1853, Chellingham produced a petition of support from some 1,500 operatives, the workers in the mills, who of course were non-voters, so their opinion may have carried only a modest weight. The plan survived a dead heat vote in the council. The mayor, having voted for it, declared the motion to continue approved. Then there were differences of opinion as to the best location in the town for the baths. There was also issues with the basis on which a government loan to finance the scheme might be provided, which delayed matters for some time. However, in October 1854, works began in Mill Street, next to the town mills, to construct what was described as a fine specimen of Italianate architecture, standing 30 feet high, on a site with a frontage to Mill Street of 50 feet and stretching 78 feet back to the river. This immediate access to the River Stour provided a ready source of water. The baths were finally underway, and here's a floor plan of what was built. Mill Street is perhaps something of a backwater today, but was then one of the town's principal streets. It was the main route to and from the north. Some of the grander families had had their own residences there, and it was to be a centre for the carpet industry well into the 20th century. And so, at 6 a.m. on July the 5th, 1855, in something of a rush because the works had been delayed by a bad winter, and so with no formal opening ceremony, the baths did open. The National Survey a year earlier had revealed that only 12 towns outside London in England had public baths, 9 of these also with swimming pools. These included Liverpool, Birmingham, Nottingham, Coventry, Hull, Wolverhampton, and the Aspinall and Whichcourt baths in Maidstone and Bilston. Kidderminster was thus a genuine pioneer, especially for such a small town. Many of these other baths were privately owned, and the Kidderminster Pool and Baths will have been one of the first truly municipal facilities financed from the rates. The picture shows the baths in the late 1870s, early 1880s. We know that because it shows the town mills before they were rebuilt in 1881. In the first month of operation, some 5,000 people used the baths, and of these, 3,378 paid 1 penny, 1 old penny, to use the swimming pool. Not all of these users would have been swimmers per se. The large pool, which is half the price of the slipper baths, would have been used by some simply for their ordinary ablutions. The pool itself measured 36 feet by 23 feet 6 inches. There were 15 private baths, slipper baths, 11 for men and 4 for ladies. These private baths, like the railways, came in a first and a second class variety. This was generally the case. There were separate entrances for men and for women. The baths housed the living accommodation of the superintendent and his wife. The wife took responsibility for lady patrons. There seems to be no expectation that ladies would want to swim. The baths had cost £3,335, 3 shillings and 5pence. And the Baths Committee congratulated themselves on saving money through a deal with the next door town mills to use surplus steam generated there to run the pump which brought water from the river into the baths. Once operational, the baths did have a rather checkered performance. There were frequent complaints about water quality and its intermittent availability. And of course the uncertainties in the carpet industry continued, and the population decline that accompanied this inevitably reduced demand for the bath services. The council though had hoped that the baths would at least cover their operating costs, and they'd had John Whichcourt's confident assurance that this would be the case, but this turned out not to be true. There was a mechanical failure requiring a new pump in 1862, and in the light of this and other pressures on the council budget, rather than repair the problem, the closure of the baths was proposed. However, the town's voters rallied to protest against this, saying that a moderate deficit would be cheerfully borne in consideration of the advantages accruing to the morals, health and comfort of the young and industrious classes. A petition was presented to the council and the baths stayed open. For the next decade or so, and as the town finally recovered from the disastrous decade of the 1850s, public health did continue to exercise the council gravely, but the focus was on sewage and waterworks rather than baths. In 1875, there was a minor cause for celebration when the loan raised to build the baths was paid off. However, the pleasure at this within the council chamber was dampened, as members and local people regularly grumbled about the actual state of repair of the baths. The poor conditions and the unwelcoming environment in the baths were drawn attention to in a letter in the KIdderminster Shuttle that year, which complained about the quality of the water in the pool and other matters. The letter said, "The water not as clear as it should be, often more like mud than water," and drew attention to a dry closet in one corner with stench enough from it to poison everything that came near to it. And finally, that respectable people have to mix up with all of the roughs of the town and be insulted and often are half drowned by being thrown into the water. The letter concluded with a hope that some kind member of the council would bring the matter of new baths before that body soon. As the letter to the shuttle had suggested, swimming was indeed becoming an increasingly popular activity. The heroic feats of Matthew Webb in his first cross-channel swim, also in 1875, gave it even greater public prominence and indeed instituted almost a popular craze for the activity. Government legislated in 1878 to put swimming provision by local authorities onto a firmer footing. In KIdderminster, however, so early an adopter of the idea of public bath provision, there was only marked inactivity on this front. Eventually, some 8 years after the swimmers' plaintive plea, there did appear to be movement on the baths front. In 1883, the town council acquired a site in Green Street with the specific aim of it housing new baths and some other activity. And in the first months of 1884, a working group of members busied themselves reviewing the achievements of other towns and cities in building new baths. There were visits to Hanley and the Potteries to see this splendid building, and to Birmingham, and information was gathered from West Bromwich. But, as to be so often the case, in the end the council couldn't face the prospect of the expense of a new baths and pool. They estimated the costs at some £5,000 to £8,000 and were not prepared to place this burden on reluctant ratepayers. News of an open-air pool in Leicester, created by taking a spur from the river, led to another visit to inspect in 1884 in the hope that this might be a less expensive option. But, before it could be properly considered, another deeply unwelcome claim on the council's time and resources had presented itself. In 1884, the town was traumatised by an outbreak of typhoid fever. In total, some 100 people died and 1,100 more were infected. A government inspection found the cause was the failure of the sewage and water system installed at great cost a little over a decade previously. It had been badly engineered, poorly installed, and inadequately maintained. Now a further wave of investment was required, which included a new reservoir. One had been built as part of the first works. The new one was built at a high altitude above the town to better deliver water to the town. The original one was, for the time being at least, expensively redundant. Grumbling about the inadequacy of the baths provision resumed once this crisis had been resolved, and as the end of 1886 approached, a golden opportunity to address the problem was seized. Specifically golden because the country as a whole was being encouraged to mark the next year as the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria's accession to the throne. Mayor Thomas Tempest Radford, seen here in his mayoral robes, proposed the construction of a new suite of public baths and swimming pools that would be the best in the Midlands, as a suitable way to celebrate the Jubilee. Tempest Radford had been the mayor when the town hall opened in 1875, so perhaps that had given him an appetite for municipal grandeur. His plans were received with great popular acclaim, and he set about raising funds by public subscription to minimise the cost to ratepayers of his scheme. A total cost of some £4,500 was envisaged. The scheme would have placed Kidderminster once again at the forefront in baths provision, lengths ahead once more. There were to be 3 swimming baths for men, 1 first class, 1 second class and 1 for boys. There was also proposed a small wash bath for boys, who were presumed likely to arrive rather grubby and so in need of soaping down before entering the swimming areas. On the ladies' side of the building there would be a further 2 swimming baths. On the upper floor would be Turkish and other bathing facilities, properly segregated for male and female patrons. A particularly radical theme was the provision of free warm baths for the working women and girls of the town in this new facility. Tempest Radford was a director of one of the major carpet manufacturers in the town. New technologies in carpet manufacture meant that the employment of women in the industry was increasing. The need for improved bathing opportunities for these working women was fast becoming more apparent. However, one group in the town was not seized with the wider enthusiasm for the mayor's Jubilee project. These were the shopkeepers and small traders who already regarded the town as being profligate with their taxes and protested that the baths were an unnecessary financial burden. The great Golden Jubilee Baths insurrection was taking shape. The opposition to the plan was led by George Isaac, which was a little awkward to say the least. It had been in the window of Atwood and Isaac's store on the Bullring that Tempest Radford had displayed the plans of his grand project to engage and excite public support. And political reform meant that these protesters had some real clout. They had the vote, and they were only too willing to threaten to throw out councillors not prepared to take heed of their views. And at the same time as this rebellion was gaining momentum, the mayor found that his appeals for public subscriptions from the wealthier folk to help finance the baths were falling on deaf ears. And in a hugely embarrassing climb down, the baths proposals were abruptly abandoned. Recrimination about this rumbled on for some years afterwards. No plans appear to survive for Tempest Radford's best baths in the Midlands. From the description that does exist, we can be fairly sure they look very like the baths that actually were built in Westbury in Wiltshire to commemorate the Jubilee, and those baths are still in use today after modernisation. Tempest Radford baths were described as having red brick, white facing in this Queen Anne style which we see in Westbury. In Westbury, very like Kidderminster, with a textile-based economy and a similar sized population, the situation was that the single dominant manufacturer underwrote the costs of building the baths. In the end, the town was able to commemorate Jubilee in appropriate style. Some years earlier, John Brinton had decided to create a town park on land he had acquired and to give the park as a gift to the town. Conveniently, that work concluded in 1887, and the new park was the setting for the various Jubilee celebrations. And so, Kidderminster, once so bold and so innovative in terms of bathing and public health, found itself, by the 1880s, lagging seriously behind. Not so much lengths ahead, as splashing about rather aimlessly in the shallow end. And indeed there was for a time sort of a lukewarm consensus that agreed, yes, it was important that the town should replace the old baths. That would be an important thing to do, but never quite the right time to spend the money or take the steps to address the problem that everyone accepted was there. However, eventually that consensus did break down. The need for action was identified, and once again, some bold, some path-breaking steps were taken by the town, which led in the end, after a long and titanic battle in the early 1930s, to the replacement of the old Mill Street baths with spankling new baths to suit the town's needs for the future.